I think as far as making predictions, like I'm just so I can't I can't do it. I feel like I feel like when I first saw Israel declares war, I was like, okay, that's actually not that surprising. There have been 3 wars in Gaza since the pullout in 2005. Um, we did see it was easy enough to see that something was coming, right? It was easy enough to see that the IDF have been in shambles because of soldiers not turning up for duty in wake of the protests, the judicial reform protests, and also in wake of the fact that Israel's demographics are just changing in a way that there are a lot more religious Zionists now, like Orthodox Jews there, and they don't fight. So it's been harder for the IDF to have people staying on or getting the right numbers, or people staying on beyond their conscription time. So Hezbollah knew that. They said that this was a big opportunity like a few months ago. They fired some shots into Israel after saying that. So to think that something was coming, maybe even a war, yeah, that's not insanely surprising. But as soon as I logged on and I saw paragliders going over the separation wall in Gaza and like seeing videos of people in the back of pickup trucks with automatic weapons just firing at civilian towns, like the fact that they penetrated the Israeli border, went into different towns and cities, and the fact that they fired off that many rockets, were able to assemble that much ammunition in one for one go, and the fact that the IDF seemed completely caught with their pants down, like just one of the biggest Israeli military L's like ever. Yeah, the fact that the impenetrable Israel got penetrated, and also watching those bulldozers knocking down the wall, like it's just that I could never have predicted that. That's insane. That's so unprecedented. But that's why I'm kind of past making predictions on this. Um, I expected pot shots. I expected Hamas would fire more pot shots, and maybe there'd be some terror attacks in Israel, like lone actors, like Intifada style, you know? Um, not like this. Not like this. Okay, so I'm gonna try to put my thoughts together on this whole thing just in one area. I tried grabbing a bunch of disparate parts from the last stream yesterday. It was just way too disorganized, so yeah, I'll just do it now instead. Based on the current, I guess we'll call it a war, because that's what it is now, a war between Hamas and Israel. Like, I think my initial hope in the last 24 hours was that my experience of talking to very far left pro-Palestine people in Western countries, like English-speaking world, is that a lot of the information that they have on a situation that's usually like foreign policy on a country that's way far away like that is usually just like what I would call like post-it note politics, right? Like you've only got your knowledge kind of like begins and ends with just a few infographics you've seen maybe on like flyers, maybe you've seen the disappearing Palestine map, maybe you've seen like a little pamphlet about the apartheid thing, or you've watched like a 10-minute video from like Vox or something like that. It always feels like it's very limited and like surface level, right? Like there's a lot of and because of that, if you want to talk about it extensively, you'll often find there's a lot of like bad history and a lot, and this is from, you'll see a lot of this on the Israeli side as well. Like it's there too. So yeah, and the problem with that is because people simplify things so much, or just have like disinformation. The other thing that accompanies so much of Israeli and Palestinian politics is it once, as soon as you pick a side, right? As soon as you pick whether you're on the right or the left, then you're going to have like a social media feed, especially Twitter, that is just so saturated with just like very emotionally charged images and events. Like if you are a pro-Palestine person and you follow a bunch of accounts on Twitter, you will see photo after photo after photo after photo, or video after video of like dead babies or like crying Palestinians carrying their dead wives back from a shootout or something like that. There's like so much of that. And if you are pro-Israel and you follow a lot of like Jewish accounts or pro-Israel accounts or even just like general right-wing accounts, you will see well, probably like examples of what we saw yesterday, right? You will see civilians being killed in houses, piled up like bodies in family homes, just like piled up, like 10 of them, all just like blood coming out of their heads. You'll see like 70-year-old women getting kidnapped. You'll see that young lady from the festival who was raped and put into the back of a truck and then paraded through the streets of Gaza, stripped, defiled, people spitting on her corpse. You'll see, yeah. And then the problem is once you've got that combination of a quite limited understanding and a quite limited set of talking points and knowledge combined with very, very emotionally jarring images, then the result is that people go quite extreme on either end. I had hoped that based on my experience with very far left people, because I feel like they're the ones that matter to me because I'm on the left, I'd hope that people who tend to have either like a kind of turn a blind eye to Hamas approach or sympathizing or just don't seem to know that much about Hamas. Like I feel like the average person, when I speak to radical left people on Israel Palestine, what they think about Hamas is they think probably just anti-Semitic, and they sometimes fire rockets that mostly get eaten up by the Iron Dome. That's mostly what most people think about when they think about Hamas. And it just kind of begins and ends there. Maybe if they look into it a bit more, they'll be like, well, Hamas are quite popular because they actually put up a fight, or they're at least aesthetically a lot less corrupt than the multimillionaires in Fatah in the West Bank. So they're seen as more reliable to provide welfare and things like that. And there's a bit of truth in that. They were originally like a charity. So maybe, yeah, like they do have that reputation. Even though they also purge people who stand against them, and they don't allow diversity of opinion, and they are very authoritarian. There's been no election since 2006. So, but I had hoped yesterday, after seeing all those images and seeing the messages from Hamas, and even a bunch of tweets showing sections from the Hamas Charter, the 87 Hamas Charter, which they still follow, by the way. I had hoped after seeing that, people would maybe take a slightly different approach and actually recognize Hamas for what they actually are, which is what we saw yesterday, in that they are not liberators. They are not, they don't have an incredible plan to they're not going to stop if settlements stop. They wouldn't even stop if the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza stops. They want to stop when all of the land is a single Islamic state of Palestine, and all the Jewish people who live there are gone, either dead. There seems to be that they're quite happy to kill anyone who is Jewish, or sent somewhere else, right? That's kind of what Hamas is. And as long as they exist, and as long as they are the power holders, the chances of a bilateral negotiation that can achieve peace between the two groups it's not really likely. Okay. I'd hope that would happen. I'd hope that would turn a few people the other way on Hamas, but maybe it has. I haven't really seen it, though. I think what I've seen a lot of instead, maybe give you the most extreme example, is 30 IQ shithead losers like this, fucking second thought, with what's going on in occupied Palestine is unprecedented. No doubt we'll have wall-to-wall coverage of atrocities. If you've seen any of the videos and you want to put atrocities in quotation marks, okay. Now that it's the genocidal settlers on the receiving end. So apparently every defiled civilian corpse that we've seen, whether they're 8 years old or 88 years old, are genocidal settlers. This is what a liberation struggle looks like. Solidarity and victory to the Palestinian people. Imagine someone comes to your town, murders your neighbors, kicks you out of your home, your family has lived for generations, and relocates you to an open-air prison. Are those occupiers civilians? No, they're criminals and accomplices in genocide. So apparently, there's no such thing as an Israeli civilian. They're all military targets. That's kind of the impression I'm getting from this. It's also how how early in life was it when each of you learned that you don't judge an entire ethnic group or national group by the actions of their state, not least of all the actions of their state that went back, what, like 75 years or even earlier? Like, the people who did the kicking out of the home in southern Israel near Gaza, in those towns, like that was quite a while ago. Do you think that people in their teens or the children or the people in their 30s or 40s or 50s, do you think they did that? But no, apparently, like, because you lived there and didn't leave, you didn't leave the country you were born in, and because you pay taxes, I guess you're fair game. Like, this is, I'm going to explain why this is not actually what a liberation struggle looks like. I don't know if you realize, but like, this is not going to lead to the liberation of Palestine. It's not. Okay, I don't know if you anyone has any illusions about that. Like, that's not what that's like. I don't even think that's what the goal is. So, yeah, was this like the largest communist video essayist on YouTube? Eek. Wow. I will say though, if you I might post this in the main channel though, just so if I do, if you were one of those people, if you actually think there's an argument to be made that Israeli civilians don't count as civilians because they were born in a state that was built on crimes against humanity, or like as many states were actually. If you if that's your position, yeah, then I'm probably not going to be the channel for you. Like, you should unsubscribe and cancel your Patreon and fuck off. And I'll trust you to not actually ever have any impact on the world, because people who hold these opinions in the English-speaking world are usually the whitest, most privileged, most disconnected, politically inactive shitheads, and you don't matter to me. Like, you have no power. You're not even trying to get power. Like, fuck off. Yeah, whatever. So that's one thing out of the way. But okay, well, hey, Lonerbox, what's your position? Okay, let's see where we start. As some of you might know, I'm half Lebanese, okay? Which means, based on like my childhood and all that, I've probably been exposed to the Israel-Palestine conflict probably a bit earlier than most people, or for a bit longer. So I think the first time I ever heard about the Israel-Palestine conflict, I think I was like 10 years old. So year 2000, I was 9, year 2000. And I think it would have been after the second Intifada broke out. And I was living in the Middle East at that time. And my best friend was an Iranian. He told me about it. He said, there was on the news, there was fighting between Israelis and Palestinians. And I was like, okay, what's that about? And my best friend at the time, who was an Iranian, said, I'm with the Palestinians because they're the underdogs, right? More of them die, basically. I was like, okay, fair, nice. I'll be with the Palestinians, do it. The next time I really noticed it was I was in Lebanon. I was visiting Lebanon in 2003. We were sitting in a little chalet room, 3rd or 4th floor up, and out of absolutely nowhere, we're just sitting there like eating fucking tabbouleh or whatever, and an Israeli fighter jet just fucking zooms past, breaks the sound barrier, and the entire building just shakes. We're just like, and then it stops. And I looked around. I was like, wait, are we under attack? Because when you go to Lebanon, you know that country has been through a lot, right? There are still bullet holes in buildings wherever you go. If you go anywhere around Beirut, there's a building full of bullet holes. And I looked around after that happened, and my Lebanese family were just like, yeah, just they just do that sometimes, you know? Because at the time, I didn't know this, Israel was occupying South Lebanon. And I think Syria was occupying as well, because there were a lot of Syrian soldiers going around. So, yeah, that was the second exposure I had to it. And then the third one was 2006, when I was at school and it was in the news that Lebanon was being bombed, that Beirut was being bombed, that they were at war with Israel because Hezbollah in the south, this was after the occupation ended, had kidnapped 3 IDF soldiers. And in response, Israel launched a ground invasion into Lebanon. Israel was quite complacent in that war. They thought that they could get to Beirut in a matter of weeks, just like they had in '86 or whenever. Oh, it was before '86. What the fuck am I saying? Sorry, dates. They were very complacent. They took probably the biggest L they had in decades. They got completely cucked and blindsided by Hezbollah's incredibly sophisticated tunnel network. And they got very frustrated with the fact that they were struggling because they went in with the most obscene goal of trying to destroy Hezbollah completely and consolidate control for the Lebanese army. They failed. The result was they bombed Beirut. A lot of people were evacuated. My grandmother and my aunt and cousin were evacuated. They had to come to the UK. And because that happened, Hezbollah, as a result, actually became more popular than ever. The leader, Hassan Nasrallah, was giving a big speech in front of a crowd, and I think outdoors, just in front of in front of a crowd in the streets, screaming about how he had been collecting the limbs of dead IDF soldiers, and that we have one goal, and it's death to Israel and all that. And I was like, yeah, these guys are like putting up a fight against those darned Israelis who fly fighter jets past fucking rooms when I'm like a kid, scaring the shit out of me. So yeah, I've been about as primed to be anti-Israel as anyone, right? Probably much more so than any of these fucking lunatics online. So I've gone through quite a lot of different phases with that. I've been involved with Palestinian activist groups when I was a student. I've got Palestinian friends and Israeli friends. So I've kind of been quite interested in this thing for quite a while, and my opinions have evolved over time. You might have noticed they sometimes change back and forth. When it comes to one and two state solution, you've probably noticed that I'll sometimes go on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I might be pro one state, and the rest of the week I'll be pro two state. And also depending on the news as well, the levels of doomerism and black pilledness can oscillate as well. More recently, I've kind of honed my personal position to a much more simple one. I don't really like thinking about one and two states because Palestinians don't agree on either of them. Israelis don't really agree that much on either of them. There's not really any peace process in the near future. That's much less likely to happen now after what's happened yesterday. So I think now what I tend to say is there are two main things that Palestinians want that I think is in line with international law and is morally correct as well, although their implementations will vary. One is that they want the occupation to end. They want to have a state. They want to have self-determination somewhere along the lines of the 1967 borders, probably land swaps to account for the settlements. That's one of the main things that they want. They want the occupation to end. That's, I think, across Gaza and the West Bank, that's the top priority. Okay, that's one thing that they want. The second thing that they want, much more contentious, is the right of return, in some form of right of return. That's varied as well. There are some people who want right of return to mean you give up right of return to Israel and just allow refugees to go to Gaza and the West Bank, and reparations for everyone else. There are different, I think, the Geneva Accords or even Camp David, where some refugees go back to Israel and the rest go back to Gaza and the West Bank. There are more maximalist ones, like the Palestine Land Society, who want all the refugees to be able to go back to basically exactly where their families came from, but they just build around in Israel so that they just kind of integrate. And then that would ideally lead to that's the utopian vision of just an intertwined one state solution where Palestinians would probably become the ethnic majority, but it's like a binational system where both groups have their rights and their dignity and their protections kind of that's the very long term. But then even thinking about that, you're okay, that's quite far off in the future as well. That sounds like there would have to be a million obstacles before we get even close to that. So then I think make it more simple, what's something, and unfortunately it's not just Israel Palestine, okay? It's Lebanon is involved, Egypt has involvement at the Gaza border, Jordan is involved, Saudi Arabia, Iran, all these countries have involvement, and actually the English speaking world is as well. The United Kingdom, Europe, America, they have all varying levels of investment into Israel, varying levels of allegiance to Israel. So what happens in our side of the world matters too, right? It matters that Trump didn't get a second term. Because if Trump got a second term, he wanted to allow Israel to annex more of the West Bank, to annex it to the point that, I mean, I can even show you. There's a map. It's actually like the most unbelievable meme. He wanted it to look like this. He wanted Israel to annex all of this and leave Palestine as this disconnected, pathetic leopard print fucking Bantustan state, which no Palestinian would ever have accepted. So it actually does matter that Biden is there instead of Trump. It matters that there were welfare projects and like hospital funding that was frozen by Trump and unfrozen by Biden. That matters. It matters that Trump was willing to try and let this happen, whereas Biden actually has broken a tradition until now. He's actually been quite quiet on Israel and Palestine, which is doesn't look great for Palestinians, but it's also not great for Israelis. It's not great for Israel when Netanyahu is going through the most aggressive protests and divisions within his own country than ever. And Biden hasn't really said that much, and Netanyahu was not happy about that. So that matters too. And it also matters that a majority of Democrats, for the first time ever, have been more sympathetic to Palestinians than Israelis, and it matters that that number is increasing. I might not, don't really know what those numbers will look like after this, but that's what was happening. So it does matter. And then I think, okay, well, what are things that would be quite easy for Israel's Western allies to agree on, because that's the part of the world that I speak to? Well, it would be the settlements. That's like the probably one of the biggest obstacles to a peace process is the fact that Israel keeps on expanding settlements deeper and deeper into the West Bank and further breaking up Palestinian communities, basically meaning that the process is harder and harder to reverse, and that the only logical conclusion is to allow Israel to try and just annex it, because they're not going to move out hundreds of thousands of people across these settlements. That's something that almost every country in the world condemns, apart from America and Israel. That's something that policy could change on. Policy could feasibly change from for the American position of actually using their support for Israel and muscling Israel into stopping expanding settlements. All the Palestinians want them to stop. Quite a lot of Israelis want the settlement expansion to stop as well. That's like a very simple policy. And there's no security thing about settlements. Actually, settlements made the security situation worse, I would say. It's basically Israel biting off more and more than they can chew. So the short answer I would say now is it's a total shambles. Pro-Palestinian activism in my part of the world is very fragmented. It's hard to get support across from the other side. So the first obvious thing, and probably the first thing that has to happen before anything else, is ending the settlements. And then you might ask, how the fuck is that going to happen now? Because after what's happened today, if America goes in and says, Israel, stop doing the settlements now, like, look at what's happening, well, then you've just given the biggest propaganda victory ever imaginable to Hamas. If Israel unilaterally stops settlements now with no party on the other side talking to them, then Hamas will double their popularity. That's like, whoa, we actually just slaughtered a bunch of civilians, bragged about it on our Telegram channels, and we got Israel to stop the settlements. So that can't happen right now. But I'm maybe going to talk you through, as much as I am black-pilled on this, I want to talk you through why maybe we don't have to be. I don't know. So I think now that Hamas are kind of in the limelight, it might be worth talking just about where exactly they came from, and what they do, how they became popular, because they weren't always popular. So I'll maybe start with that. We're 20 minutes in. Okay. Why can't Biden just push the end settlements button? I have no idea. Anyway, so I don't want to look at this map. Give me another map. There we go with that. So I'll just talk. Sorry. I think what I'll talk about first is this is the map as it has been since 1967. Israel occupying Gaza and the West Bank. Maybe starting with 1987, the first Intifada. In 1987, there was a big uprising in Gaza and the West Bank. I think it started after an Israeli vehicle ran over 5 people, I think, in Gaza, something like that. And then that sparked a wave of strikes, protests, a lot of nonviolent action, and also a lot of violent action. A lot of clashes between people throwing stones and occasionally shooting guns at the IDF, and also a good share of terror attacks. A lot of people died. A lot of civilians died, more Palestinian than the Israeli, but yeah, there was a lot of attacks. And that lasted 6 years. 87 to 93. I think what happened during that period is quite a few developments happened on the Palestinian end. One is you have the birth of Hamas, a group that was originally a charity group that operated schools and mosques and healthcare services and other kind of like welfare provisions. Hamas comes out of Gaza. They go from being a charity into a party, into a political movement. And they were originally nonviolent. They originally didn't have weapons. They were always anti-Semitic, rabidly anti-Semitic. Israel tolerated them because they thought Hamas could be a good counterweight, political counterweight to the secular nationalist forces of the PLO. So Hamas becomes a party. They have support from about 3% of Palestinians. It's hard to estimate that, but it's quite low. They're not massively popular. Most people at this time are Arab nationalists. So that happens. Hamas gets born. They are born with the intention and the charter saying that they want to obliterate Israel. They want to use violence. They're going to use any means necessary. It's full of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and screeds, and they basically want to annihilate Israel and turn all of this into an Islamic state. A single Islamic state. And it's quite clear, based on what happened yesterday, is that once they do that, they want either all the Jewish people living here to die or to leave, right? So that's Hamas. On the other end, something else happens in the second Intifada, first Intifada. The other thing that happens is Arafat and the PLO, who were originally liberation, like a militant group who wanted also to wipe out Israel, changed their tune. So in 1988, their leader, Yasser Arafat, stands in front of the UN and says their new policy is they're going to recognize the state of Israel, even if Israel doesn't recognize Palestinian state yet, and we're going to denounce terrorism. We're going to renounce any terrorist actions. So you have these two parties in the West Bank and Gaza, born out of the you have these two movements that basically get one gets formed and the other one gets kind of honed during the First Intifada. The First Intifada ends in 1993. And after all that violence, 1993, you also have something called the Oslo Accords, when the Israeli Prime Minister, Rabin, signs an accord with Palestinians, not promising a state, not recognizing a state, but they do recognize the PLO, Arafat, as the legitimate leaders of Palestine, as the legitimate government. So they set up like a government under the occupation. They devolve responsibilities to certain areas of the West Bank, like security for some parts, and security and like education and civil affairs to them. So then they start a negotiation process that would ideally lead to two states. That was the idea. Although the Oslo Accords never mentioned that. They never mentioned two states. They just mentioned like something that was interpreted as moving towards that. So that happens after quite a lot of violence. And the reason that happened was because even though the First Intifada had just happened, you had a movement in you had a Palestinian movement in the PLO that were willing to negotiate and were willing to denounce terrorism and were willing to recognize Israel. And because they got the Oslo Accords out of that, and because they started to see a peace process unfolding, that group got very, very popular. Hamas grew, but not by that much. They have their first election in, I think, the mid-90s, and Arafat the pro-negotiations person, wins by like 90% of the vote. He completely crushes the opposition. Hamas boycotts it, but I think even if they participated, they would have only got like 15%. They were like quite low. So they have a clear mandate for peace negotiations. The peace negotiations ultimately fail by the 2000s. You have another outbreak of violence. I won't go into all that because it's a different video. And then when those peace negotiations fail and violence erupts, Israel elects also, the peace negotiations failing, I mostly would say that the blame falls on like the Israeli and the Clinton side, but people will contest that. There's arguments on both sides. I'm not going to get into that anyway. Fuck. So there's an outbreak of violence. The second Intifada, which is much worse than the first one. There's a lot of terror attacks. There's a lot of Israeli buses getting blown up within their own borders, full of there's like pizza places getting blown up. Yeah, there's a lot going on. And Israel elects a very, very, very right-wing prime minister called Ariel Sharon, who doesn't believe in negotiations. He doesn't think Palestinians can ever be negotiated with. There are several attempts to start negotiations between Israeli liberals and the PLO at this time. Sharon basically snubs it all. So by this point, negotiation is done. And then in 2005, after the Second Intifada, Sharon, who doesn't believe that Palestinians can be negotiated with, unilaterally pulls out of Gaza. Mostly because I think they didn't want to ever govern 2 million Palestinians. They didn't want to have that many Palestinians absorbed into their state. They didn't want to be responsible for them. They couldn't expand settlements further to change the demographics. It was too small. So they just left. They just pulled the IDF out. They pulled out 8,000 settlers. And then, because it was unilateral, Hamas, who have been incredibly violent for the 5 years prior, takes responsibility for it. They say, this happened because we terrorized the Israelis into realizing that settling on these lands was not worth it. Negotiations were in the bin. Negotiations were cucked. They didn't say it in that way. Terrorism was what got us the disengagement from Gaza. So Hamas takes a huge W here. They become incredibly popular, and then they establish themselves to basically ever since 2005, 2006. That's kind of them ever since. At the same time, around the mid-2000s, or 2000, same thing happens in North Lebanon. Well, similar thing happens in North Lebanon when Israel withdraws their occupation, mostly because they feel like it's not worth governing this area with the amount of attacks coming from Hezbollah. So ever since then, it's been very difficult for a Palestinian leader to come up and say negotiating with Israel as an equal partner is going to lead to anything. The Palestinians feel like that's been tried. They feel like it led to nothing. They feel like terrorism got them Gaza, and it got the Israelis out of South Lebanon. So that's kind of where things have been since then. And the problem is that because of that and all that violence coming from Gaza and also fermenting in the West Bank as well, is that Israel feels like they need to step up their security, and stepping up security involves things like checkpoints. It involves keeping a blockade on Gaza. It involves the border fence. It involves building a massive separation wall in the West Bank. It involves humiliating citizens every day. It involves choking off their economic opportunity. And it basically does involve this thing you hear about Gaza, the open air prison. And again, you can say it's understandable that people feel that hopeless and desperate that Hamas is their only option, especially when there's no variety of opinion really allowed under that rule, and there are no elections being held, and there's no promise or no historical promise that negotiations can achieve anything. And that's what happens. And then that kind of, like a pressure cooker, bubbles up into what we saw yesterday. That doesn't mean Hamas are excusable in any way. That doesn't mean Hamas are good. It means, well, Hamas are a disgusting organization. Same with Hezbollah. But that just explains why they're there, right? I don't feel like I need to explain to you guys that Palestinians don't just roll out of the womb being Holocaust denying, Jew killing like people, right? That's not really what happens. That's a long process that culminates in that. Which is also why, though, it does mean that when it comes to where we go forward, the problem now is that every Israeli person who considered themselves on the left is going to be right wing now, at least for a while. Because when you see that happening, when you watch, that happens on their side as well. When they watch videos of people who, of civilians, of kids, of old people getting like mutilated and paraded through the streets, and there's an entire crowd of people out there celebrating, well, then they're going to feel like, well, we need a big strong man to contain that and stop that. And it's very irrational. It's very not. It's going to embolden groups like Hamas even more, because the response will ultimately kill a lot of civilians, and then Hamas will capitalize on that, and it'll just go back and forth. Yeah. So you are stuck in this, like, yeah, we'll call it cycle of violence. I don't care if that triggers some people, because that's what it is. The problem is that doesn't take anything away from the fact that Hamas is not a liberation organization. They're not decolonial. They're not any of those things. They are a genocidal fucking death cult who are propped up by Iran mostly, and who I don't really know exactly what their end goal is or how they plan to achieve it. Right now, they're basically trying to it seems to be that the reason they did what they did yesterday was to put a wedge into normalization talks between Israel and Saudi Arabia, because Middle Eastern countries over time have become a lot more amicable to Israel. Like Egypt has, the UAE has in 2020. They're the first Middle Eastern country actually to have a Holocaust education program, the first Muslim country or Middle Eastern. Yeah. Hamas hates that. Saudi Arabia are in the middle of a process of normalization with Israel, potentially. But Saudi Arabia also wanted, in exchange for that, more dialogue and more progression and more concessions on behalf of Palestinians. That's basically impossible now, because again, if Israel concedes anything now, it's because of a terror attack. It's because of a war, which they can't do. But the reason I bring up all that history is because, again, Oslo did happen right after the first Intifada. It happened after a period of violence, of terror, of civilians getting killed. And a peace process actually came at the end of that, right? The problem now is that when people do this thing where they say, like, I've noticed a bunch of Twitch streamers all having like Free Palestine in their Twitch. And I think I went into one of those channels and they were like, well, yeah, we say that even though after we've seen all the civilian deaths and everything, is because the way that you make all this violence stop is just Free Palestine, just end the occupation. And then people won't feel like they're going to vote for Hamas. But then the problem with that is that if you free Palestine now, like unilaterally, what's going to happen? Hamas will claim victory, and they will be really popular in the West Bank as well. That'll be the most optical W any party has ever taken, ever, if that happens. So the only way that can happen, and the way that it happened in 93, was that there needs to be not only pressure from Western countries. I don't think Israel's going to do it on their own. Sorry. I also think there needs to be some leadership in Palestine that is willing to negotiate with Israel and is willing to recognize Israel and is willing to denounce terror. I think that needs to happen. But how hopeful am I for that happening? Not really. I just think it would be nice to get back to some level of basics, that when people keep on using these ridiculous euphemisms of saying that, like, what happened yesterday with Hamas was what, like, armed struggle or decolonization. Like, armed struggle is the word. That what they did yesterday was not armed struggle. Okay, it was butchery. It was senseless. It was terror. Okay, and don't just take it from me. Okay, we can take it, and I've said this enough times now, but we'll do one more. You can take it from Nelson Mandela, someone who actually did engage in armed struggle. It would be good to know just like a few details about that, though. This is Nelson Mandela talking when he's on trial for violence. But this is what he said about it. This is him explaining the strategy that the ANC adopted when they turned to violence. So they said, 4 forms of violence were possible. There is sabotage, there is guerrilla warfare, There is terrorism, and there is open revolution. We chose to adopt the first method. Sabotage did not involve loss of life, and it offered the best hope for future race relations. Bitterness would be kept to a minimum, and if the policy bore fruit, democratic government could become a reality. The initial plan was based on a careful analysis of the political and economic situation of our country. We believe that South Africa depended to a large extent on foreign capital and foreign trade. We felt that planned destruction of power plants and interference with rail and telephone communications would scare away capital from the country, thus compelling the voters of the country to reconsider their position. So I would say this looks a bit more like armed struggle, I would say, because this is someone who actually knows the difference between levels of armed struggle or guerrilla warfare, which would involve probably killing soldiers or police, and then terrorism, which is when you go for, like, I guess, civilians, and then open revolution. Yeah, and I'm sorry, like, if I said this, if I'd said this and substituted like South Africa with Palestinian, like if I just changed a few words around, all these fucking morons on Twitter would call that like lib shit, right? They would. But this is actually what armed resistance looks like. This is actually what a liberation struggle looks like. I would actually rather take it from someone who achieved something than this supercar reviewing charlatan fucking fraud. I'm sorry, okay? I'm just using him as an example because I think this was the craziest one I saw of all the tweets. I did see other ones, but I'm not going to do a fucking firing line of all of them, okay? We'll just do it to him, you know? I'm punching up, big channel, okay? So I hope that gives a slightly clearer understanding of where I am on it and why I think the general left-wing trend online about this has been quite bad. I don't say that about everyone. Some people have said quite good things. I think they're quite agreeable things. But calling... I don't know if I need to pull up one of the images of a civilian's corpse, defiled, mutilated, being dragged through a town square where everyone celebrates and stomps on it and spits on it. I don't need to show you that, but if you think that is what armed struggle or revolution or any of those things looks like, I don't know, just like I'm happy that you're not an activist and you're just a shithead on the internet, but like I would just maybe patiently ask you to reconsider, because it's a euphemism. It's like a dog whistle almost. To call that armed struggle it's not. It's killing civilians. For what? For what? Like, to make Saudi Arabia a bit less likely to normalize relations with Israel, to have Israel retaliate in the way that they almost definitely will, to have the amount of Palestinian civilians dying, I think it's already at what, 300 plus. Well, that doesn't help Palestinians. It doesn't help them. It helps Hamas. Hamas will become very popular because of it, because people will see their people dying at the hands of the IDF, and they will be driven more into the hands of despair and hopelessness that is Hamas. So, What stops Israel from just giving the civilians in Gaza a few weeks to evacuate, then shelling it to hell? The recent attacks all came from their right, and it would send ... Where can they go? Civilians in Gaza can't go anywhere, my friend. They can't. They can't go to Egypt. I don't think Egypt is going to let in an influx of like, what, 1 million or 2 million plus refugees from Gaza. They're not going to go into the sea. I don't care how big that American aircraft carrier is. They can't do that. And actually, also, if I think Hamas doesn't take kindly to dissenters, if they see a bunch of civilians trying to get out of the way so that the IDF can have a clearer shot of them, they're in danger for doing that as well. So there's no good outcome for Gaza. Like, it's really, really sad. I don't know. Um, anyway, even if they're left, their homes would be rubble. Yeah, because unfortunately, it's not like I know it's a bit of a meme because of what how Israelis talk about it, but it's not untrue. Hamas are really good with when it comes to blending in with civilians. That's why they often avoid wearing uniforms. They uh, enjoy the fact that Gaza is so densely populated that they're kind of very their buildings are very indistinguishable from civilian buildings. Which actually I don't even know. Maybe someone can tell me about this in comment section or chat. Like I don't actually know if civilians in Gaza know exactly which buildings are Hamas and which ones aren't, or even which people are Hamas and which ones aren't. I don't think people know. I feel like maybe they do, but I feel like if there's a way of Gazan civilians to find out, then there'd be a way for the IDF to find out as well. But yeah, that's a difficulty. There's no easy way to do that. Um, how should Israel have responded? I think the problem is that they first of all they have to close off the border, right? Like they can't just not do that. They have to get around the border and reclaim all these parts here. Because there are hostages, they almost definitely have to go into Gaza as well. So but I think Hezbollah have said that if they do, if Israel makes an incursion into Gaza, that's going to be incredibly dangerous for them, and that also means Hezbollah are willing to come in from the north if they do that. So, yeah, I mean Hezbollah said that. I don't know. I actually, if they do get involved properly, I'd wonder what took them so long. But maybe it's part of the plan. I don't know. It's more than 2 million living in Gaza. It's like 2.5 or something. It's quite high. Yeah, I mean, like this absolute crime against humanity of a human being. What did you all think decolonization meant? Vibes, papers, essays, losers. I don't know. I feel like I don't know if they're doing it on purpose. I don't know if being on Twitter or just like turns your like the interior of your skull into like a pool of bleach. I don't know. Like, is there really no difference? Is there really no gradient between vibes, papers, and essays and slaughtering civilians and spitting on their corpses? Is there really no gradient between that? You fucking moron. If I asked this person to just tell me like how did the decolonization of South Africa work? What exactly? Talk me through like the 60s to the 90s. This person would just cry and shit themselves. Like they have no idea. Yeah. Eh, anyway, I think I think the problem as well is outside of the total brain damage, but the other problem as well is that I feel like it's so hard to communicate about this topic because people are so I think most people don't actually care that much about specific policy or specific interpretations of specific event. I think mostly people care about rhetoric, right? So if I say something like, and I've noticed this as well, like is when I did that video talking about the Sabra Shatila massacre, where in Lebanon, where the Israeli defense minister allowed a group of Christian militants to go into a refugee camp and kill like 3,000 people over the space of 2 days. When I mentioned that massacre, brutal event in Middle Eastern history, uh, a lot of Israelis got upset that that was the massacre that I spoke about. I was like, why didn't you talk about the other massacres in Lebanon in the civil war that didn't involve Israel? Why did it have to be the Israeli one that you spoke about? Why didn't you talk about Damour when Palestinian militants massacred a bunch of Christian civilians? No one knows about Damour. Oh well, if I talk about Damour, why don't I talk about Karantina? You know, when a bunch of when before Damour, when Christian militants murdered Palestinian civilians, like in Lebanon. Yeah, it's just there's this problem where uh, even if you say something that's factually true, like people will find a way to politically pigeonhole you because that was the fact that you chose to speak about. And I think that's like a really, really frustrating thing to engage with. But Um, I think I'm maybe better just disconnecting myself from that level of partisanship. Yeah. Anyway, listen, I hope you all feel slightly more informed now than you were 45 minutes ago. Uh, okay, fuck off.